The Pentagon has updated its war casualty database, adding more than 140 wounded and restoring 4 soldiers killed in Iranian strikes last weekend since the US launched its war with Iran on February the 28th. 18 US troops have died and 624 have been wounded. Now, this comes after the Pentagon faced scrutiny last week when an apparent data glitch on the website meant the casualty numbers actually decreased. Well, CNN's Davis Winky joining me from Atlanta for more. And understandably, people now seeking further detail on the latest casualties, the updated figures, who they are, how they were injured, and why it is that these numbers were reduced over the weekend, not increased. Davis, what do we know at this point?
Becky, this saga is really interesting in that it goes a lot to show the way that this Pentagon's approach to transparency breaks from that of previous administrations. They've been treating the Defense Casualty Analysis System, this online database, as the ongoing source of truth that the public and the media can access for updated information on war casualties. The issue with that, though, is that we've been observing this website on a minute-by-minute basis for a week at this point, and we saw data fluctuations. We saw numbers changing from minute to minute. And those fluctuations, when they would appear on the website and be reproduced by people who are looking to it as the source info for casualty info, led to widespread scrutiny, whether it was from the media, and it also came from some lawmakers. The 12 Democratic senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee wrote a letter to the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, last Thursday, demanding answers on the issues with the database. They updated it over the weekend to add these additional casualties, as you said, and they also added a new category called Overseas Operations, which is distinguished from their Operation Epic Fury category, Epic Fury being the first phase of the Pentagon's war with Iran. The new Overseas Operations category is interesting because it doesn't have a ton of information on the where these things occur, how these things occur, and we're waiting on clarifying info from the Pentagon on that. But the really important bit is that it starts on July 7th. That's significant, Becky, because the Trump administration says July 7th is when a new conflict with Iran began for the purposes of the War Powers Act. You know, the U.S., the president has 60 days to conduct military action before they need congressional approval to continue. Trump admin said that clock stopped from the first phase of the war when they declared the ceasefire in April. What with the new period of the conflict starting on July 7th, that's the significance of why we're seeing the new category pop up to align with that date moving forward. Becky?
That's fascinating. Good to have you, Seb. Thank you.
The full cost of this war is becoming clearer. Over the weekend, the Pentagon quietly updated the total injuries and casualties since the start of Operation Epic Fury. An online Defense Department database now lists more than 600 wounded. That's up from 482 just last week. It also lists the total number of troops killed as 18. This coming on the heels of outrage, frankly, over the Pentagon removing 4 names from the war's official death toll. The deaths of those service members have been reinstated, but in a new category. The Trump administration telling Congress that Operation Epic Fury is over and a new operation is now underway.
These databases should really be reflecting reality, regardless of the political niceties of the War Powers Act or, which operation you're in, whether it's Epic Fury or the follow-on to Epic Fury or something else. But the key thing is that these databases be accurate and that they reflect the true nature of the cost of war.
Joining me now in the group chat, Sarah Fisher, CNN senior media analyst and senior media reporter at Axios, Laura Davison, Washington deputy bureau chief at Bloomberg News, and Francesca Chambers, White House correspondent at USA Today. The fact that the Defense Department is classifying deaths, injuries in a different way, also looking to do overseas operation versus Operation Epic Fury, that has a really significant impact, Francesca.
And this also comes after President Trump himself said that the number was 18 last week, while he was justifying the ongoing war in Iran and defending it, especially after the House had just taken that vote to say that the operation should not continue in Iran. He said that it was 18 compared to some of these other wars that lasted years and had thousands of deaths. So, just putting that out there as an acknowledgement from the president himself of what the death toll in this war has been. Now, as far as how they're trying to reclassify it at the Pentagon, I was speaking to House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier in the month, and or at the end of last month, and he had also said that he thought that the 60-day clock on this would restart if the Trump administration had the ceasefire break down and then restart. That seems to be the argument that the Trump administration is trying to make now, which is that this is a new conflict. Clocks restarted on this congressional approval timeframe.
It is fascinating, though, to watch the back and forth here. I mean, this is, right, and certainly the backlash that we saw, this is all entirely of the administration's own making, message-wise.
Yes, and it's part of a larger communications failure around the war. And it's not just deaths, it's also how and when does this ceasefire actually start? When does it conclude? I think that the American people are not naive. They look at this conflict in its totality, which is it didn't have to be a war of our making. It was a war by choice, as the Democrats are saying. And they don't really care whether or not a death occurred in one part of the war or after a ceasefire. They just want to understand holistically how many people were hurt, how many people were killed. It also matters a lot for congressional funding, because when you're asking Congress for money, one of the things that you have to consider if you're a member is, do we need to give more funding to protect people's lives? Well, if you don't have a real accurate sense of how many people's lives are being impacted, how do you make those decisions? And so this is a crisis of confidence in terms of not just how much we are reporting, but also how we're communicating it. I don't think the American people are buying necessarily this reclassification of the numbers.
An administration that likes to bill itself as the most transparent, right, in history, and you're dealing with a Pentagon that is not, frankly, transparent and is not as forthcoming with information and in making themselves as available. There has also been reporting about some pushback from Vice President Vance, as well as General Kane. Mike Walls, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was asked specifically about the low stockpiles. One of the things that he noted, I'm paraphrasing here, was that part of the reason the stockpiles were so low was because of the Ukraine war, because of decisions made under President Biden's administration. In speaking with military officials, it's not really that simple. The fact, though, that the stockpiles are being questioned, how does that add to complications for this administration when there are questions about just how prepared and for how long the U.S. could be involved?
This really just shows how few options the administration has at this moment. This is kind of a classic supply and demand problem of there aren't enough missiles that can be resupplied. The defense contractors have been to the White House multiple times. Trump has really been haranguing them to produce faster, but there's lots of regulations. They have to be produced domestically. They just can't keep up with the speed at which they're being used. Secondly, the Pentagon is also needing more money. You've seen Hegseth up on the Hill asking for $70 billion more to fund this war. The administration doesn't really either have control over, the production of these or the money. That's Congress's job. All they can do is control how quickly they're using them. So we're seeing now, that at least the reports that they're talking about rationing them to, be able to, have a war that was supposed to last 4 to 6 weeks. Now we're in that 4 to 6 months range, and who really knows where this ends?
We were told too over the weekend, this is a pause, right, to allow diplomatic efforts to continue. Is there a sense that there's any change in those diplomatic efforts, any change in the part of the United States or even Iran on what is potentially being offered?
I mean, we've seen this repeatedly, right? That the negotiations are on, then the negotiations are off. Then the U.S. was bombing for nearly 2 straight weeks, every single night, trying to force Iran to get back to the table. So it's very difficult to say at this point where these talks, stand and how much longer we expect the war to go on. On the munitions stockpiles, though, I just want to add that, allies around the world are concerned, I think, about the munitions levels in case of another potential conflict breaking out somewhere else. The United States is, having to tap into some of the munitions that it has in other places. You've got countries like Ukraine where it isn't being given stockpiles from the U.S. anymore. It is buying those through NATO, but asking to co-produce missiles and weapons with the United States. Now, just saying, let us produce them at this point. We can do it just as quickly. And so this is part of a broader argument about readiness around the world for conflicts.
Absolutely.